The day I bought my first house. I thought my parents would finally be proud of me. Instead, the first words out of my mother's mouth were, "You bought a house without asking us." I smiled and said, "I paid for it myself." She didn't smile back, because they hadn't planned for me to buy my own house. They had planned for something very different, and when they realized their plan had fallen apart, they became furious. My name is Aria Bennett. Buying a home had been my dream for as long as I could remember. Not because I wanted a big house, not because I wanted to impress anyone. I wanted one place in the world where every key in my pocket belonged to me. A place where nobody could tell me, "This isn't your home anymore." For years, I lived carefully. While friends upgraded their cars, I kept driving mine. While others booked expensive vacations, I stayed home. Every extra dollar went into savings, not because I was obsessed with money, because I was obsessed with freedom. My parents knew I was saving, but they never asked why. Whenever I turned down family trips or expensive dinners, Dad would laugh. "Life's too short to save every penny." Mom agreed. "You should enjoy yourself." I always smiled. "I will. Just not today." They assumed I was saving for a nicer car, or maybe a wedding someday. The truth never crossed their minds. I wasn't saving for something temporary. I was saving for a foundation. One Saturday morning, my real estate agent called. The seller accepted your offer. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Then I whispered, "Really?" She laughed. "Congratulations, homeowner." I sat in my car for almost 10 minutes after hanging up, not crying, not laughing, just breathing. Some dreams take so long to reach. You don't know how to react when they finally happen. Closing day felt unreal. I signed what felt like 100 pages, collected a small envelope. Inside, 2 house keys. The lawyer smiled. "Welcome home." I held those keys tighter than I had ever held anything. They weren't just keys. They were proof that every sacrifice had meant something. The house wasn't huge. It had 3 bedrooms, a small front porch, an old oak tree in the backyard. The kitchen needed updating. The paint needed work. The fence leaned slightly to one side. To anyone else, it looked ordinary. To me, it looked perfect. I spent my first weekend cleaning, painting walls, building furniture, eating pizza on the living room floor because I hadn't bought a dining table yet. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. I decided to invite my parents over the following Sunday. I wanted to surprise them. I imagined Mom walking through the front door, smiling, maybe even hugging me. Dad would probably inspect everything before saying, "You did good." That was enough. I wasn't looking for applause, just a little pride. Sunday afternoon, their car pulled into the driveway. Mom stepped out first. She stared at the house. Dad looked confused. "Whose house is this?" I smiled. "It's mine." Both of them froze. Mom blinked twice. "What do you mean, yours?" "I bought it." There was a long silence. Then, instead of saying, "Congratulations," Mom frowned. "You bought a house." Without talking to us first. I laughed nervously. I wanted it to be a surprise. Dad's face grew serious. "A surprise?" He slowly shook his head. "No. This changes everything." I frowned. "What changes?" My parents exchanged a quick glance. Then Mom quietly said something that made my excitement disappear instantly. We already had plans for this house, even though they hadn't known it existed until 30 seconds earlier. I stared at both of them. We already had plans for this house. Mom nodded like she'd said something completely reasonable. Dad folded his arms. "We just assumed you'd discuss something this important with us." I looked around my living room. The paint was barely dry. There were still unopened boxes in the corner. I've owned this house for less than 48 hours. Dad replied, "That's exactly why we're upset." I frowned. "I don't understand." Mom sighed dramatically. "We've been talking about downsizing for months." "So, we thought you'd buy a house big enough for all of us." For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. Dad walked toward the hallway. 3 bedrooms. He nodded approvingly. "One for you, one for us. And the spare room can be your sister's whenever she visits." I stared at him. "You've already assigned the bedrooms?" He looked confused. "Well, of course." I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was the only thing keeping me from crying. I never invited anyone to move in. Mom looked offended. "You shouldn't have to. We're your parents." I slowly sat down on the couch. "When exactly did you decide all of this?" Dad answered without hesitation. "Months ago. We assumed this was your long-term plan." "My long-term plan?" "Yes. You buy the house. We sell ours. Then we all live together." I blinked. "You planned my future." Without asking me, Mom crossed her arms. "Families make decisions together." I looked at her. This wasn't a family decision. It was my mortgage, my savings, my signature, my responsibility. Dad's expression hardened. "So you're saying there's no place for us?" I calmly replied, "I'm saying this isn't what I bought this house for." Mom walked into the kitchen. She opened cabinets, checked drawers, even looked inside the pantry. "What are you doing?" "I'm seeing where our things would fit." I couldn't believe what I was watching. She wasn't imagining moving in. She'd already accepted it as reality. Then something caught my attention. Dad pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. He placed it on the kitchen counter. It was a floor plan, not of my house, of furniture placement. His handwriting filled every room. Master bedroom, Mom and Dad. Guest room, Emma. Office, Aria. I stared at the paper. "You made a layout." He smiled proudly. "I wanted everything organized." I looked at him in disbelief. "You gave yourselves the largest bedroom." "In my house." He answered as though it were obvious. "Well, we're the parents." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I quietly folded the paper, handed it back to him, and said, "I think we've had very different ideas about what buying my first home meant." Mom suddenly looked frustrated. "You've changed." I smiled sadly. "No, I've just finally made a decision that wasn't based on making everyone else happy." The room grew silent. Dad glanced around the house one more time. Then he quietly asked, "So where exactly are we supposed to go when we sell ours?" I looked at him. "Why would you sell your house?" "Before even asking if you could live here." Neither of them answered, because deep down, they knew they had skipped the most important step. As they walked toward the front door, Mom turned around one last time. "You really aren't going to reconsider?" I shook my head gently. "I love you, but loving someone doesn't mean giving up the life you've worked years to build." Dad opened the front door without another word. Just before stepping outside, he said something that stopped me cold. "We've already paid the deposit on our new retirement apartment because we told them we'd be moving into your house first." The front door closed, and I stood there, realizing this wasn't just an assumption anymore. My parents had already made financial decisions based on a promise I had never made. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I felt guilty, because I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. My parents had made plans for my house without ever asking me. That wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an expectation. Monday morning, I tried to focus on work. Around lunchtime, my phone started vibrating again and again and again. When I finally looked, I had 12 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and more family messages than I'd received in months. Something was wrong. The first message came from my aunt. "Aria, I'm disappointed in you." The second was from my uncle. "Your parents sacrificed everything for you." Another cousin wrote, "I never thought you'd leave your parents with nowhere to go." I stared at my phone. What were they talking about? I called my aunt. She answered immediately. "Aria, I honestly expected better from you." I frowned. "Better?" "Your parents said you promised they'd live with you." My heart sank. "I never said that." She paused. "What?" "I never invited anyone to move into my house." Silence. Then she quietly replied, "That's not what we were told." That evening, I drove to my parents' house, not to argue, to understand. Dad opened the door. He knew why I was there. "We need to talk." "I agree." Mom was already sitting at the dining table. Her phone rested beside her. I placed mine next to it. "Why is everyone calling me?" Dad sighed. "We had to explain the situation." "What situation?" Mom answered, "That you changed your mind." I looked at her in disbelief. "I changed my mind? About something I never agreed to?" Dad rubbed his forehead. "We might have spoken too soon." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You told the family I invited you to live with me?" Mom quietly nodded. "We thought it was already decided." I took a slow breath. "No, you decided." "I didn't." Dad stood and walked to the living room. When he returned, he was carrying a folder. "I suppose you should see this." He handed it to me. Inside were printed emails, real estate listings, moving estimates, retirement brochures. Every page had handwritten notes, dates, budgets, furniture measurements. They'd spent months planning a future inside my house, a future they'd never once discussed with me. Then I reached the last page. Across the top, in Mom's handwriting, were the words, "After we move into Aria's house." Below it, a long list: sell current house, cancel utility accounts, transfer mail, store garage furniture, use house sale proceeds to help Emma buy a condo. I read that last line again, then again. I looked up slowly. So this was the real plan. Neither of them spoke. "You weren't selling your house because you wanted something smaller." Dad looked away. "You were selling it so you could help Emma buy her own place." Mom whispered, "We wanted both of our daughters to have homes." I nodded. "And you expected me to pay for yours." The room fell silent for almost a minute. Finally I asked, "Did either of you ever stop and think that I might have dreams for this house?" Mom looked genuinely confused. "What dreams?" I smiled sadly. "Exactly. You never asked." I stood up. "I'm not angry because you wanted help. I'm angry because you treated my future like it was already yours." As I reached the front door, Dad quietly said, "The buyers are coming Friday." I stopped. "You already accepted an offer?" He nodded. "We signed the agreement last week." My stomach tightened. "But if you don't let us move into your house, we won't have anywhere to stay between moving out and getting our retirement apartment." I slowly turned around. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about expectations. My parents had built an entire chain of decisions on an answer they had never bothered to ask for, and now they expected me to rescue them from a problem they had created themselves. I drove home in complete silence, not because I didn't know what to do, because I finally understood what had happened. My parents hadn't asked for my help. They had built an entire future around my life, without ever inviting me into the conversation. Friday arrived. Dad called early that morning. The buyers are coming in an hour. I wished him well. He hesitated. That's it. I smiled softly. What else would you like me to say? He didn't answer. That afternoon, Mom called. Her voice was shaking. The closing was finished. I hope everything went smoothly. It did. There was a long pause. Then she quietly asked, "Can we come over?" I looked around my living room. The sunlight poured through the front windows. For months, I'd imagined this house becoming a place of peace. I wasn't going to let anger change that. "You can." An hour later, they arrived. This time, neither of them walked through the house. Neither of them talked about bedrooms, or furniture, or moving in. They simply sat at the kitchen table. Dad looked older than I remembered. "I've been thinking." I stayed quiet. For weeks, I kept saying you should have consulted us. He smiled sadly. But the truth is, we never consulted you. Mom nodded. We planned your future. We spent your space. We made promises that weren't ours to make. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry." For the first time, their apology wasn't followed by an explanation or an excuse. It simply existed, and somehow that made it real. Dad reached into his jacket. He placed an envelope on the table. "What's this?" "The spare key to our storage unit." I looked confused. "We rented one. Until our retirement apartment is ready." "You didn't move into a hotel?" He smiled. "No. We finally realized our problem wasn't yours to solve." I couldn't help smiling. Not because everything was fixed, because they had finally accepted responsibility. Mom looked around the kitchen. "You've made this place beautiful." I laughed. "It's still a work in progress." She nodded. "So are we." A few minutes later, Dad stood up. "We should go." I walked them to the front door. Before leaving, he turned around. "I spent months thinking this house should become our home." He looked around one last time. "I finally understand. This house was never meant to save us. It was meant to be the reward for everything you sacrificed." A few weeks later, I invited my parents over for Sunday lunch. Not because they expected it, because I wanted to. Dad brought dessert. Mom insisted on washing the dishes. Neither of them acted like they owned anything. They behaved like guests, respectful guests, and somehow that made the house feel even more like mine. One afternoon, my sister stopped by. She looked around the backyard. "It's peaceful here." I smiled. "That's why I bought it." She nodded. "I used to think success meant having people take care of you." She looked at the little garden I'd planted. "I think I understand now." "What?" "Success is building something that's actually yours." 6 months later, my parents finally moved into their retirement apartment. It wasn't large. It wasn't luxurious, but they chose it themselves, paid for it themselves, and every decision inside it belonged to them. One evening, Dad called. "I just wanted to tell you something." "I'm listening." "I used to believe parents should always have a say in their children's biggest decisions." He laughed quietly. "I've changed my mind." "What changed it?" "You didn't buy a house without respecting us. You bought a house while respecting yourself. And there's a difference." After the call ended, I walked onto my front porch. The old oak tree swayed gently in the evening breeze. I unlocked the front door, then locked it again. not because I was afraid someone would come in, but because every time I turned that key, it reminded me of something important. A home isn't valuable because of its size, or its price, or how many people can live inside it. A home becomes priceless when the person who worked for it is finally free to decide who gets invited in. And sometimes, the strongest boundary you ever set is the one that finally teaches the people you love how to respect you